Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Higher Ed Happy Hour podcast. My name is Robert Johns, and I'm excited to host this roundtable discussion on a topic that is very important to us here at Unincorporated, human-centered design. And as the COO, I'm not the expert in this area, which is why we have a few members of our awesome design team with us today to share their insights. Ian and Rebecca, how are you both?
Doing well.
Good. Doing great, Robert. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So in order to set the stage a little bit, to get us into the conversation, I'm hoping you can start by defining human-centered design. What is it?
Yeah, great place to start. Let's define it right up front. Human-centered design, HCD. This is a core principle of our creative process and strategic thinking here at Unincorporated, but it's also a term or phrase that's pretty popular right now. A lot of people think of it as the modern way to market or do your branding. But, HCD or human-centered design, it's really just an intuitive framework, an intuitive way of thinking about your strategy, your messaging, and your creative by putting the human or the user, at the kind of the central point or the focal point of your efforts. It puts the human needs and those wants or desires at the forefront. Anytime you're developing a campaign, advertising creative, web design, a user experience, an on-campus experience, an in-classroom experience, anytime you're thinking about your brand messaging. And from a practical perspective, it really just requires the higher education professional or administrator or agency partner to think about who is our audience, who is that prospective student, and what are their needs and wants? What are they trying to accomplish? How do they see themselves in our campaign? How do they see themselves on our website? And really just designing around that experience, around those needs and wants.
Rebecca,
I like to think about human-centered design as a mindset more than anything. It's really just trusting human intuition and thinking about, as a human, what do you respond to positively and negatively? What are the humans at the end of the relationship or at the other side of the creative or the other side of the messaging? How are they going to react in their lived experiences? What are they bringing to that interaction? And how are they going to react to what you're presenting positively and negatively? So it's a pretty intuitive process. I like that Ian mentioned that, because you do have to trust yourself and your experiences, but also rely on what other experiences people are bringing to that interaction.
Yeah, empathy is one of the cornerstones to that mindset. So being able to empathize with the other person, the person that you're engaging or the person that you're designing an experience for. And that can be very intuitive. I mean, we're all humans, right? So if you can just put yourself in the mindset and in the place of that end user, then you're doing human-centered design just by virtue of empathizing with, where they're coming from. Why is it modern? That's, I think, a question, why has it taken us so long to do this intuitive way of thinking or develop this intuitive way of thinking? Well, it used to be that marketers, advertisers, even designers, they would be like kind of talking at their audience, expressing, these are all the best reasons why our college, our campus, our university is amazing. These are all the best reasons why our product is amazing. So it's really like, speaking directly at your user or at the human. Whereas human-centered design is more about how do we engage a conversation with the other person, and how do we think about their needs, their concerns, the questions that are running through their mind, and how do we meet them basically on their turf and engage them with a conversation so that we're not speaking at them, but rather speaking with them.
And I've heard, you hear user experience a lot. I know we're going to get to that a little bit later on. But this idea of human-centered design feels like a relatively new concept, like kind of last maybe 5 years or so. Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so I actually did a deep dive on this recently, trying to figure this out because it's such an interesting concept. Some people were attributing it all the way back to Plato's Republic and the idea of democracy, grassroots democracy, people taking part in designing the community and the system that they are living in. That obviously changed and evolved over thousands of years at this point. So we kind of trace it back to like the 50s and 60s when like humanist psychology was happening. And that's also when technology started changing and people could actually take part in testing the products that were being built for them. It kind of continued to evolve from there a little bit. First, it was kind of user testing. Like, is this actually going to work for the end user? Which was that kind of like omnidirectional relationship that Ian's describing, where we're like, I am producing this product, confirming that it works for you, and then I'm hands off from there. I think around the 2000s is when we started thinking like, how do we involve users and humans in the process throughout, like from beginning, assessing what it is they're actually looking for and building a product around those needs rather than making sure that that product fits into their life after the fact.
Yes. And there are a handful of white papers and a lot of research around, okay, well, what was the moment? Why was there this shift in the marketplace? Why was there this shift in the way that marketers, communications experts, advertisers, why did they move away from talking at the consumer or the user? And why did they start to empathize and engage the consumer? And the reason is because online platforms started to receive feedback. So you had like a platform like Yelp where you could no longer just ship your product and deliver it and, you know, whatever, end of story. We were now getting feedback and reviews, and user feedback is actually one of the critical components to ensuring that you're developing great human-centered design. But right around that time of this shift, it's because we started to receive, the marketplace started to receive user feedback directly and publicly, which of course made advertisers, marketers, service providers, etc., more receptive to that feedback.
It's fascinating. And I mentioned UX a second ago. That's the kind of term that I'm maybe most used to. It sounds familiar. Are these the same thing? How does UX and human-centered design, how do they play together, or how are they different?
Yeah, I can take that. I think UX is a part of user-centered or of human-centered design, and honestly, in today's society, they're kind of used a little interchangeably. Even the way that we're talking about it, we're saying humans sometimes and users sometimes. User experience is typically considered specifically for products and services. I think human-centered design considers it a little more holistically, beyond like user testing and beyond making sure things work. We're thinking, okay, what is their mindset? What is the empathy of it? What is their emotional state when interacting with this product, service, messaging, design, whatever it is? So making sure it works, that UX piece, that is definitely part of it, but human-centered design considers it a little more holistically. I would say that that's the primary difference in how we talk about it. But with the caveat that this is kind of an ongoing discussion in today's society. And I think that we'll see these terms evolve, continue to evolve. And it'll be interesting to see kind of 5 years out how we talk about the differences between the two, if at all.
Good UX design is always considering the end user. It's always considering the human at the center of the experience. Bad UX, user experience that doesn't, and we have all had these experiences, right? We go to a website and it's broken on our mobile, or we tap on a button and a pop-up covers the thing that we were trying to read, or we go to scroll and it doesn't respond, right? So user experience is a spectrum, good to bad to great even. And what makes great UX is the capacity at which it delivers on the human-centered experience, the capacity at which human-centered design is driving that user experience, because it puts the user in the driver's seat. And so great UX is delivering exactly what every user wants, what every user expects, and what every user is thinking. And it delivers on that.
That's such a great segue. Thank you for saying what you just said, because I think we've done a good job of defining what it is, what human-centered design is, but we haven't talked about kind of the how. How does someone implement human-centered design? Is there a process involved? Is it pretty straightforward? Like what does the actually doing human-centered design look like?
Yeah, well, Rebecca and I both have a few examples, and I think probably our examples relate to the type of work that we direct here at the agency. So, for example, I'm largely responsible for the communications, the larger message that a university is trying to put out. And in order to design the message with the human at the center, oftentimes what we'll do and what I'll guide the client through is first asking, we call it empathy mapping, but it's basically mapping the empathy or the mindset or the questions to the message. So we're going to ask the university partner, what questions are top of mind for your prospective student? Again, the two questions are, who's your audience and what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they asking ultimately is the outcome of that. So a prospective student at your MBA program, what types of things are they thinking about? Tuition, location, course load, what courses there are, how this benefits them. So we map that. We diagram all of those questions in a way that maps back to our communications. And so we use empathy mapping and outlining those particular questions in a way that informs our communication strategy. Another way we do this, oftentimes, let's say if we're designing an online curriculum or we're thinking about an in-class design for a classroom, we might actually go and observe that class as a silent participant. And we call this ethnographic study. So we're actually going to watch and learn how the class interacts with the course material, how the class interacts with each other, how the class interacts with the professor. And by doing this ethnographic study, this silent observation, you can actually pick up a lot of cues about that user experience and figure out ways to optimize that experience by observing the humans within that experience.
Yeah, in person is always great because it just gives you such a well-rounded view of that person. What they're bringing to that classroom can even be informative. Clothes they're wearing can be informative. On my end, I'm more on the design side, less on the branding and messaging side. So I'm thinking about like, what are people looking for? Not only in terms of messaging, but what is accessible to them? What devices are they using? What screen sizes are they operating on? Any kind of data I can get from the actual audience can really inform design decisions. That can be even figuring out their route to work to figure out which billboard we should design for, right? Other tactics that we use on the design side are really any kind of user testing we can do. So whether it's paper prototypes that we can put in front of either our client or a prospective user and see how they interact with that. Card sorting and affinity mapping to see how they group different areas of information, such as whether it's admissions information, like where they're looking for that on a website, or where they're looking for events or ways to get involved with a university. One of the biggest things on the digital space and design space is accessibility and ensuring that we are considering kind of all of the fringe cases to make sure that people can interact with the content kind of no matter what. So we do pretty extensive accessibility testing to ensure that our content is perceivable by everyone and that everyone can interact or operate that information or that product appropriately given their own limitations. So that's one of the biggest ones I would say. And then obviously we're always pursuing more diversity and inclusion as part of that. So on the visual side, ensuring that we are using not only diverse photography, but also a diverse set of people to respond to any design mockups or design options to ensure that it is resonating with that more inclusive audience.
Yeah.
Number
One of
of
the
triggers, essentially.
One of the challenges with human-centered design is that you have a diverse group of users typically accessing your website or accessing your app, your mobile app. And oftentimes what you have to do in the design process is kind of think in terms of generalizations, right? You have to reduce the experience to the lowest common denominator, so to speak. So how do you personalize it? If you truly want the best and most ideal human-centered experience, then you have to personalize it. So I think there's a number of ways, like an assessment form, again, thinking about the prospective student applying to that MBA program. Maybe there's an assessment form that does a little intake, and then the communications that follow that intake are more personalized. So there's ways that you can raise the barrier or the baseline standard from lowest common denominator to a more personalized or hyper personalized, if you're really reaching for the ideal hyper personalized experience. I know you asked for practical things that you can do. We're going to have a whole list on our blog that lists out all of these practical things, but what we covered are ethnographic study, empathy mapping, using a story brand methodology, that's putting the prospective student as the hero of your story or of your communications. Rebecca mentioned doing stakeholder interviews or like intake interviews, any kind of user testing or prototyping where you can actually get real live feedback, measuring accessibility standards and looking at that data. And then, of course, measuring or looking at the diversity and the inclusivity of the experience. I wanted to also add to this that a simple review of your analytics, your Google Analytics, it will tell you the user flow. It will tell you where those cliffs are when your traffic is dropping off, or those pages where people are, where their attention is remaining. And through that analysis, you can also start to design the experience, putting yourself again in the shoes of the human through that user flow on your Google Analytics and thinking, okay, at this point, we lost a handful of people. Why is that? How can we make that experience better? Or on this page, we have a lot of human interest and people are staying here for a long time. So how do we leverage that? And how do we lean into that? So analytics, I think, is another practical way to deploy human-centered design.
I was glad to hear you mention story brand, because something you said earlier kind of stuck out to me, which is historically, or maybe in the recent past, marketing was all about talking at people, right? It's like kind of us to them. But story brand is a way to help bring the person, the user, the human, to use our terminology, into the story, put them at the center of the story, and we're bringing them along with us instead of just saying, hey, here's who we are, what we do, you need us. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And you can learn a lot more about story brand on our website. Reach out if you want to know more. So we've covered kind of what it is. We've covered how you can start to do human-centered design. I want to talk about some examples. How do we see this play out in our daily lives? What are some ways that we're seeing human-centered design without maybe even realizing it?
I think the first thing I'll say is, like, every product in your life, everything you interact with has been designed by someone. And I don't think we fully realize that sometimes, whether it's, just looking around my desk, the monitor that I'm looking at, my keyboard, my mouse, like all of those have been considered for probably way more hours than I ever realize to make it optimal for my experience. So when we think about, obviously that doesn't touch our work. We're not into like the physical product design at this point, but human-centered design is a through line in everyone's life. From our end, we're obviously talking more about like digital projects with messaging, but I kind of recommend everyone look around at the things that they surround themselves with, because you chose that mouse for a reason, because it fit your needs versus the mouse that fits someone else's needs better, right? So I think we see it everywhere, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's in plain sight, right? You just have to turn to any website and you can see human-centered design at play. One example is a CTA, Apply Now, right? It was not too long ago where you had to hunt around a university's website in order to find the Get Started Now or Apply Now call to action. Now, obviously, that's going to create some friction in the user experience for the prospective student that's ready to apply now or ready to apply to financial aid. So if you just make that a little more accessible and that call to action more visible, you are in fact doing human-centered design. You're making a clear call to action, so when the human is ready to take action, they don't have to spend any time looking for it. Now, here's the somewhat slippery slope of human-centered design. Rebecca just did a presentation on this yesterday, and I flagged this for our group. The thing is, with human-centered design, it runs the risk of manipulation, because ultimately you're appealing to the human to get them to act in a certain way or make it easier for them to act in a certain way or believe a certain thing about your product or service. And so it opens up this risk of manipulation. You have to do design for good because you have the power to influence the human's actions. So putting a CTA visible is good for the user, but it's also good for business. It's a little bit manipulative, right? So just a word of caution. And I know that my mentor, Don Miller, talks a lot about this with StoryBrand. The moment you learn how to put your audience as a center of your story, it runs the risk of bending the hearts and minds to your will. So be careful with that. Another place where we see human-centered design, good and bad. Sorry, Rebecca, you had a comment on that?
I was going to say there are entire websites dedicated to essentially bad UX that track things like this, right? And we saw it a lot a few years back when like every newsletter pop-up, the opt-out button was something like, no, I don't want to save money today. It's super manipulative and super almost like grimy feeling. But they were using essentially human-centered design thinking because they were like, people don't want to actively not save money. That is not a human interest. People want to save money. So let's manipulate this and force them to like intentionally opt out of this quote unquote positive thing. It's super interesting. Their entire library is dedicated to like tracking this now and calling brands out. So I think it's gotten a little bit better, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's great that there is that level of like crowdsourced accountability, if you will. But if you're slick with human-centered design, no one's going to flag it for you because it's going to feel natural to the user. So that's, I guess, your own accountability is required at times. There are some really simple examples of this too. I don't think people would imagine their emojis as human-centered design, but there was once a time where you had to type out laughing out loud, which became LOL, which now became an emoji, right? So at some point, the designers or the design industry realized that, hey, humans want to communicate effectively exactly what they're feeling. So how do we enable that communications more effectively, more seamlessly, and quicker? And now we have emojis, which I think were born out of a human-centered design need. Same thing we see in terms of the number of clicks that it might take you in order to get to an application, or the number of clicks it may take you to get to find the major of your choice. So just simplifying the journey, or making it easier for someone to communicate with you, or making it easier for someone to find information, is a big facet of human-centered design on websites in particular.
Yeah, one that I've been really hot on lately is search functionality. When we think about how humans search online, it has totally shifted in the last, 5-10 years. Gen Z in particular, they do not navigate websites. They search for whatever information they're looking for. They grew up in the age of Google, I would say. And Google has gotten better about answering questions rather than having people need to type in the exact precise language to search for the right page. And so we're seeing this with university websites where a lot of them are implementing search fields and placing them fairly prominently. Kind of where I think it's dropping off is the search result page hasn't been as considered through that human-centered lens. So it often feels just like a Google listing that's unsorted and like there's no hierarchy to it. The best universities, I think, are implementing hierarchy and saying like, hey, here are the programs that match that search term. Here are the news articles that match that search term. Here are the faculty members. Which one of these are you looking for? And I think when you could put that level of human-centered design thinking into an experience we know that everyone is using, that's when something really magical happens.
So true. Let's repeat that so everyone heard it. Gen Z. And I think even if that could be up-leveled to everyone on the internet now, we search, we don't navigate. So design your search capability or functionality on your website in such a way that enables the fact that we search, we don't navigate.
If you take anything away from this conversation, maybe take that.
That's the thing.
Yeah. We've talked about a lot of examples about how we see this play out for colleges and universities already. Do you have any other specific examples of how human-centered design gets deployed in higher ed? I'm thinking back to a specific conversation we had recently about the design of classrooms and how the way classrooms were designed historically was about efficiency, costs, like let's make it cheap and easy to put together. And Ian, you had this conversation, so I'm sure you have way more insight than I do, but just reimagining how a student uses a classroom can increase the amount that a student can learn.
Yeah, so there's a huge opportunity for human-centered design improvements within classrooms, within curriculum. That in itself could be a whole separate conversation. If we're thinking just purely, say, on the recruitment marketing side of the equation, because I know a lot of our listeners are higher ed professionals and they're responsible for finding those best fit students and maintaining their enrollment numbers. One thing that we saw and we were actually able to collaborate on that I thought was really effective with human-centered design is we developed a whole campaign around key questions. So we did empathy mapping around key questions of financial aid. And those questions led to a series of videos which were sent out via text instead of email or instead of embedded pages on a website. So when a prospective student was interested in the program and said, opted in, I'd like to learn more about financial aid, they received a series of messages delivered by students, fellow students, college students, about how to apply for financial aid, the do's and don'ts, what's at risk, what to avoid, the best way to leverage, the best way to look for money. And that was delivered via text message. And in that sense, it did two things on the human-centered design front. One, it addressed a significant need, which is how do I pay for college? And secondly, it delivered it in the modality of communications that students of today's era, they're most likely to receive.
A few other things about that particular project that I think lend itself toward human-centered design. One is we put students in the video. So students were actually the ones delivering the message. So it felt like peer-to-peer communication. The second thing we did was we shot the video and we cropped it vertically because we knew we were going to be delivering it via text message. So to watch the video vertically made far more sense than kind of shooting like a standard video and having somebody rotate their phone over. Third thing, every video was captioned. So for people who maybe had couldn't hear as well or whatever the case may be, needed to watch it on silent, they had that ability. And finally, we did all the videos in both English and Spanish. So depending, no matter what type of student that video was going to, they could kind of all around, it made it easy for basically anybody. You talked earlier about we had to personalize it. That was a way that we could make it as personal as possible for everybody who might possibly receive that information.
And it's like a case study on human-centered design. And the style in which the videos were shot, edited, and scripted felt like TikTok videos. So they had that I call it edutainment. It was like education, but also sizzly and entertaining to watch, which again, just kind of plays into How does the user expect to consume this information? How do we keep their attention in a way that's meaningful to them? And so the TikTok flavor of these videos, I think, is also a component of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Rebecca, anything else before we kind of head towards the end of this conversation?
No, I mean, I think we talked about a lot of good case studies about how we leverage it for higher ed.
Cool. So some people who are listening might be hearing this conversation and it sounds like a quote unquote nice to have. Maybe it's a little frou-frou. Maybe it's a little, hey, I've got, bigger things to worry about than human-centered design. So I'm curious if you could answer the question, what's at risk if someone does not apply this principle or this way of thinking to their work at a college or university?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate risk is that they will just not connect to that prospect or to that end human who is reading that message, seeing that Instagram ad, visiting that website. They're going to alienate their prospective audience and ultimately hurt their enrollment numbers, hurt their brand perception, and kind of be worse off. When you don't consider that human at the end result, you run the risk of coming off really tone deaf and potentially alienating, insulting your user, just kind of giving them a really negative experience overall. So we just want everyone who interacts with our clients, our brands, the university partners that we have to have a really positive experience and really build a positive relationship so that you don't come away with your bad taste in your mouth, essentially.
Regardless of whatever you're trying to sell, if you're trying to sell your latest research, if you're trying to sell your endowment, if you're trying to sell the naming right on your building, if you're trying to sell your curriculum, if you're trying to sell your new program that you just launched, whatever you're trying to sell, at the end of the day, it comes down to one thing and one thing only. And that is, are you connecting with your prospect? It's about connection. Even if you're trying to sell the learning outcomes as a faculty, and we're not supposed to sell anything, right? But at the end of the day, we are selling knowledge, or at least trying to connect with the user to sell the learning outcome. To Sell is Human. Great book by Daniel Pink, by the way. This is in our nature, and it comes down to connection. So if you're not doing human-centered design, you're not connecting. What's at risk is the lack and the inability to connect with others, and that's at the root of everything that you're selling.
That's good.
Honestly, it reminds me of what Ian first said about how this sort of started. It started happening when people started having other options, essentially. Is if your program is up next to another program that's of similar nature, people are going to gravitate to the ones that connects to them. If there's one that's alienating them, that's the one that they're not going to go with. So yeah, to sell is human. And we live in a society where we are in competition and we are competing for attention. So the more that you can connect and the more that you can build a strong relationship to your prospect, the more chance you have of, guaranteeing success for yourself and for your institute.
It's awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I'm hoping, Ian, you can maybe put a bow on this for us and talk about some other resources or books, ways that people can learn more about human-centered design.
Oh, are we wrapping now? I was ready to go for another hour if you wanted to.
Hey, go for it. I'll be here.
Final thoughts, key takeaways. The most important thing that I can leave the listeners with, is just remember that human-centered design touches every aspect. It's kind of what I was just saying, but it touches every aspect of what you create, of what you design, of what you deliver. And that's from your messaging strategy to your brand position, to the user experience on your website, to your ad creative. And when you simply put the human at the center of your thinking for all of that, and you understand this basic principle, you can effectively communicate and connect with your audience in a meaningful and lasting way.
That's great. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you both, Ian and Rebecca, for being here. It's a great chat. And that's it for this episode. So thanks for listening.